Today we'll be looking at some different labor unions and some various strikes that resulted from this motivation to improve workers' conditions and wages during the turn of the century. First up, in 1869, we had the Knights of Labor founded by Uriah Stevens, and their membership included both skilled and what would be considered unskilled workers. Due to a series of failed strikes, this group pretty much declined into nothing. They disappeared. Next up, we have the American Federation of Labor, founded in 1886 by this guy, Samuel Gompers. And unlike the Knights of Labor, who did both skilled and unskilled, the AFL only took in skilled workers. Next up is the American Railway Union, founded by Eugene V. Debs, who is one of the most well-known socialists in American history. And this group also took skilled and unskilled workers like the Knights of Labor, and they are pretty heavily socialist thanks to Debs. Debs was a very ardent socialist, and they really pushed that agenda. Next is the Industrial Workers of the World. They're founded in Chicago in 1905 by William Big Bill Haywood, and abbreviated the IWW, or Wobblies. And like the American Railway Union under Debs, this is also a fairly socialist group. If you notice this political cartoon, you have the IWW hand with a knife that says Industrial Unionism, about to stab what is meant to be an octopus, referenced as capitalism. So it's a heavily socialist organization, which, remember, at this time and even still today, socialism has a very bad context in American society. An important person from this time period related to labor unions is Mary Harris Jones. She supported the use of strikes at this time, and she was very crucial in exposing the cruelties of child labor. Now, when both wages and poor working conditions combine, labor unions would call for strikes. Some examples of some strikes, or first off some terms, would be a scab, who is a strike breaker, meaning somebody who's going to work or trying to break up the strike. Yellow dog contracts were contracts the company would put out where you would promise to not join a union. And a blacklist was created for basically any worker who was very pro-union, where they would say, we're not going to hire you, and you're pretty much kept from getting a job because you're on this blacklist to be as a known union activist. Now, the first strike we're going to talk about is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. And basically this was due to wages. Twice in a month, their wages were cut. And the outcome was President Hayes came in and ended it, and they went back to work. Followed up by the Haymarket Riot, which was the most violent labor union strike at the time. So this is 1886. Its impact was due to the 1877 strike being ended prematurely by the president and nothing really being resolved. Because of how violent it was, the public began to turn against the labor movement. So this is a very, very violent confrontation between strikers and police and riot police that the company hired. We then have the Homestead Steel Strike in Homestead, Pennsylvania, which goes from June to November of 1892, and 12 people died, and it had to be broken up by the Pennsylvania National Guard. So if you're noticing a pattern, a lot of these strikes turned pretty violent, both due to the strikers and to the company and the government intervention. The final strike we're going to talk about is the Pullman Strike. And with populism, we mentioned how the Panic of 1893 sent the country into a recession. Here, Eugene Debs led this strike. And when the economy recovered, the man Pullman, who you learned about earlier for the railroad cars, he didn't restore wages or decrease rent after the recovery. So the recession happened. Wages went down to keep their jobs. He never brought them back up. He fired or blacklisted many of the strikers. and eventually President Cleveland at the time broke it up. And finally, it wasn't a strike, but this event has a very dramatic impact on worker conditions, and that is the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. It was a high-rise building in New York City where they made clothing, and due to several issues with worker safety, ranging from basically a line where they only could go out one by one to avoid theft, to fire escapes falling apart, 146 women died in this fire, and it showed how deplorable working conditions could be. And due to this fire, it's kind of the origin of a lot of our modern workplace safeties.